So this video is going to be about the end of World War I. We're going to be talking about the human and economic costs of the war, and the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which is the treaty that um, kind of determined the terms of peace and what would happen with all the countries after the war was over, and then how the U.S. government responded to the Treaty of Versailles. So to get started, I just wanted to show you this infographic that I found. I want to point out that there was a lot of civilian deaths in World War I. 6.6 million people died, and 2 million of those were in Russia alone. And I just want to remind you that when Russia entered the war, they were much less technologically advanced than all the other countries. They were much less industrialized. And then they end up having to leave the war because they have a communist revolution, and everything is going to change for Russia. So that's a lot of people to die that are not actually soldiers in the war. 8 million soldiers died, and that's about 6,000 deaths every single day of the war. So sometimes I think we don't even realize, like, the population of Europe was still smaller at the time. And so it's kind of incredible to think that a lot of, like, marrying age men were just gone from Europe, because the majority of those deaths came from Europe. So it left a huge gap in who could get married. So sometimes, I mean, European women had to kind of look a little bit harder. And this is going to kind of, even in England, break down some of the old, like, social structures, because people couldn't marry in their social classes all the time. Sometimes they needed to marry outside of them. And 21.2 million people were wounded. That's an amazing amount. In all, 65 million men fought in World War I, from about 40 countries and dozens of colonies. So that's so many different people involved, so many deaths. It was an incredible impact on the world. And sometimes I feel like World War II almost overshadows World War I. Like, we don't realize that it was World War I that's going to reshape the world into a lot more similar to what it is today, because it's going to rearrange governments, it's going to rearrange power structures, it's going to take down kings and queens in Europe, and then it's going to raise up more republics, more democracies, stuff like that. So the human cost to the Allies alone was more than 5 million soldiers, including about 112,000 Americans. So that sounds like a large, but honestly, compared to what Europeans lost, that's not a huge number. The Central Powers lost about 3.4 million soldiers, and millions of civilians died in the Great War. We already showed on the infographic that there was a lot. The estimated cost of the war was more than $330 billion. Can I just say that the United States actually ends up making a lot of money on the war, and that's because, like, a lot of that debt that is going to be owed to us. So France and Great Britain will owe us tons of money, billions and billions of dollars, because of all of the food and weapons and supplies that we sold to them during the war. Germany is already struggling. We already know that there was, like, riots and, like, people were starving in Germany, and that's one of the reasons that Germany had to leave the war, and Kaiser Wilhelm stepped down. So actually, like, after World War I is over, which we're going to get more into it, but Germany is going to be forced to pay for the war. So, like, a lot of the war debt is going to be put onto Germany, and it's going to drive them even further down. So people, like, Germany is going to be desperate, very, very poor, and actually that's going to be one of the things that gives rise to Hitler. And some people are starting to be afraid that in Europe, all those economic problems could lead to communist uprisings, like the one that had just happened in Russia, because remember that Russia had just been taken over by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and that's going to be a whole nother chapter of history. So Wilson came up with a plan for the world after the war was over, and his goal was to have long-lasting peace. So he wrote a plan that with 14 different points, talking about, like, having self-determination for colonies, having each country having its own self-determination, and he wanted more democracy around the world. He didn't want to punish anyone for the war. He just wanted peace. He also came up with something called the League of Nations. It's actually like an early version of the United Nations that we have now, which basically was supposed to be a peacekeeping organization where countries could meet and talk about their problems and try to settle their disputes through something called collective security. So the problem was that not everybody was for that. Like France and Britain wanted to punish Germany again, especially France, because like the majority of the damage and like where the war was actually being fought, a lot of that was in France. So France was even more angry than Great Britain, and they wanted to make sure that Germany never rose to power again. So, and actually in the United States, even though Wilson was not for punishment, a lot of Americans also agreed that Germany should be punished. The irony in that is that the way that Germany was punished for the war is going to be exactly what leads to having Hitler in power and World War II. So at the peace conference, President Wilson actually personally attended the peace talks, but the Russian leaders refused to attend because remember that they were the Bolsheviks led by Vladimir Lenin, and the Central Powers. So we're talking about Germany, Austria-Hungary, like that group. They were not even invited. And the final settlement was called the Treaty of Versailles, and it required Germany to pay for the entire war. Or to pay for a lot of the war. It's called reparations for damages and expenses caused by the war. So even though the total war was like 330 billion, they were supposed to pay about 10% of that. It did give some groups the rights to self-determination. So that means like some countries that used to be colonized were then set free through the Treaty of Versailles. It also placed the former colonies of the Central Powers under Allied control, and it did agree to create a League of Nations, which had come from Wilson's 14 points. So the League of Nations would be an assembly that included a representative from each member state or each member country. The council would have 5 permanent members that would include Great Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and the United States. And just so you know, this is very similar to the United Nations now. It's the same thing. We have like a council, a peacekeeping council, or it's called the Security Council, and there's 7, I think, members of the Security Council. And I can't remember how many permanent ones, but there is a group of permanent ones. The disputes would be submitted to the Permanent Court of International Justice, or the World Court, and then the penalties for ignoring judgments were a ban on trade and military force. So, by the way, the United Nations today does not have any real enforcement abilities. Like, that's, again, complicated, but in this one, the League of Nations would have the option for military force. The United Nations does not have that. So there was some opposition to the treaty, especially in the United States. Republicans, for example, were worried that membership in the League of Nations would involve the United States too closely in European affairs. And our old way of doing things was more isolationism, where we kind of keep out of it and keep to ourselves. But Wilson tried to build public support by going on a speaking tour, but he ended up suffering a stroke and never fully recovered. So the U.S. Senate refused to approve the Treaty of Versailles, and the United States did not join the League of Nations. So even though it was our own idea, we did not join. So that's how the war ended. And I just want to emphasize that punishing Germany the way that it did in the Treaty of Versailles is going to lead to massive depression, and eventually is going to lead to the rise of Hitler.